welcome back myself. This is, as everyone knows, this is the third of 3 panels that have explored issues surrounding the Native American presence in the West since the period of pre-contact, earlier 19th century, and today we try to take that story up to the present. So I'm joined here today by an economist, a journalist, an attorney, and an archaeologist. And what I thought I would do is begin the conversation by just asking each of them to very briefly identify 2 or 3 key challenges facing Indian country today. And I think once we have some of these big issues out on the table, we can sort of drill deeper, go back into the 20th century and sort of try to understand some of these challenges. And then eventually, if we have time, turn to how we can begin to address some of these challenges. So we'll just go down the road, gentlemen. Terry, 2 or 3 challenges.
All right. Thanks, Marty. I want to open by reading 2 quick quotes from the dedication of my book, Unlocking the Wealth of Indian Nations. One by Chief Joseph, and it's not the "I will fight no more forever." I love this quote. "Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to walk, think, and act for myself." Followed by a second, more recent quote by good friend, former chief of the Shuswap Band of Kamloops Indians, Manny Jules, who says, "All we're asking for is the same right that other Canadians have, the right to own property." I think those 2 things, those 2 quotes really lead me to my list of what changes need to occur. I've, in a paper I wrote for a conference last spring, characterized the history of American Indians. I really think it's a history of indigenous people, especially in those people in the British colonies, as going from old indigenous economies, which were vibrant, which were adaptive, which allowed the people who lived with the resources we've been talking about not just to survive, but to thrive. And obviously not everybody thrived, but they did thrive. And they had institutions that I think underpinned that survival. They were shifted to colonial indigenous economies, especially in the 19th century, and that continues today. And the difficult problem is to get out of colonial economies to what I like to think of as renewed indigenous economies. And to renew indigenous economies, I think the challenges are to, one, get Manny Jules what he says they'd like. Just let us own our land. Indians don't in the United States and Canada. We treat them as incompetent to own land. So to get control of their own land, to have the sovereignty they deserve, the respect that comes with sovereignty, and then tribes and as groups will have to develop governance structures to deal with the collections that they have. But until tribes are able to somehow escape from this colonial institutions that have held them hostage for well over a century, there isn't a lot of hope in my mind for change. I might just note, take a look at indigenous.econ.org, a website led by a group of tribal leaders who are trying to find the answers.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you. Just now I start to cough. I think the 2 interesting challenges for this era, one is it's really hard to understate how significant Standing Rock was to people's mindsets. It changed everything. It was when people walked through those camps and saw the flags flying from tribal nations, really indigenous nations around the world, people immediately, their first question is, where is my tribal flag? And second, how can we do something more? And you look at the landscape today of people running for office, people engaged in civil disobedience, people engaged in trying to change tribal economies. All of them point back to Standing Rock as that moment that changed everything. Of course, Standing Rock is part of a long story. It's similar from Alcatraz. It's similar from Idle No More in Canada. It's part of an ongoing thing. But it changed people's perceptions in a huge way. Right after the election, a group of tribal leaders got together in Phoenix, and they asked me to give a speech. And they said, would you talk about something off the charts? We want something we've never heard before, and do something different. And so I basically wrote a speech about how do we start to plan now for the end of the United States, and what happens to tribal leaders for the next 10,000 years. What kind of priorities can we put together so that tribal nations will continue no matter what happens? And it was a really engaging conversation about what that might look like and what people need to do to make that work.
Great, thank you. Sheldon?
Pevawona. My name's Sheldon Spotted Elk. I'm Northern Cheyenne, so I'm from the tribe that killed Custer. That's our great gift to humanity, so you guys are welcome. You're welcome. So I answer the question, I provided just a little bit of context. So federal Indian law, it's a body of law. And in the short, what it's describing is the relationship between the three sovereigns of our U.S. democracy: federal government, states, and Indian tribes. And so there's 4 principles that you really need to understand to kind of really take a delve into what modern tribes and what tribes are, how we operate today. And so those 4 principles being, 1, tribal sovereignty, being able to assert your law over an area. And I think that is the biggest, I would say, one of the premier struggles that we're facing. I'll say that first and foremost: tribal sovereignty and asserting that in state and federal courts, and having that recognized by the federal government. Second principle is federal trust relationships. Those treaties build a federal trust beneficiary relationship. When Terry talks about Indian property, and that's the third principle actually, is that land oftentimes is held in trust, and property, when tribes hold property, actually are missing one of the sticks, so to speak. Those went to law school. When you talk about property and it's a bundle of sticks, they're missing that one stick, is the ability to transfer it. And then fourth is limited state authority. So those are the four principles that we talk about when we talk about federal Indian law. But within all that, and a lot of the work that I do is I work with children, actually. I represented children in foster care, juvenile delinquency a little bit. And so how do we deal with, and this is something that I think on the ground, myself, I think most Indian families that are living in tribal communities, is that there was a 500 years of terror that tribes lived in. That they were told, and not only just policy terror, psychological terror, where they're told they weren't good enough, that their ceremonies were simple, that they weren't intelligent enough, that they weren't good enough parents, that their communities were substandard, and children were removed. And so dealing with that historical trauma, and I say that as number 2, is being able to cope with that historical trauma. We all have a part in that, actually, all of us, is being able to move towards truth and reconciliation. And I know that's kind of a buzzword, but being able to speak that truth and be able to move forward together and with reconciliation. So I say those are the 2 biggest challenges, in my opinion, that we're facing as Indian country today.
Mark?
Well, with all the challenges that face Native communities and that have been articulated here, it might seem trivial that I'm going to talk about archaeological sites, but I don't think it's trivial to Native people, their connection to their past and to the physical remains of that past on the landscape. And so I think a profound challenge for the future is having Native people have, a greater voice in for lack of a better word, the management of those archaeological resources, and 2, have a greater voice in telling the story of their past.
Okay, so it seems like one of the themes that has come up here really is this theme of tribal sovereignty. And I'm wondering if we can just dig a little deeper into what that means. What does tribal sovereignty mean? And how do we relate the idea of tribal sovereignty to the concept of Indian citizenship? Because over the middle half of the 20th century, it didn't happen instantly in the 1920s, Native peoples became full citizens and voting members of the United States. So what are the challenges that emerge as people try to exercise tribal sovereignty while simultaneously functioning as American citizens? Where are the tensions there? Where do we see these difficult points? I'm gonna look at you, Mark, and then Terry, yeah.
Well, that dual nature of sovereignty, where you're both a citizen of your tribe and a citizen of the state and federal government, is something that folks have juggled with a long time. I think one of the areas where it's really played out, that so much of the Native story is invisible. It happens, it occurs, we know about it, but it doesn't make the national press. It doesn't make the larger story. And one of those is on citizenship. One of the real success stories has been Native Americans in state government. We now are at, if you look at the population of the country, we're about 1.8% of the population, and state legislatures are 1.1% Native American, which sounds like both really tiny numbers until you consider that Congress is 1/3 of 1%. There have been significant gains. States like Montana are basically at parity now with legislatures. Minnesota is at parity. Oregon's at parity. And you're starting to see a voice in state government as citizens with this dual nature. I think duality is just in general a concept that more Americans need to hold. It's not something really taught in schools, but the idea of being able to hold competing ideas in your head is essential to thinking about this. It's part of the politics, it's part of the actual practice, and yet we're not taught as children how to hold competing ideas.
Good point. Can you speak to this?
I think that the sovereignty issue is really tied up in or difficult to deal with on reservations because the land is so fractionated. It's such a mosaic of tenures. There's the trust lands, that some of which belong to the tribes, some of which belong to individual Indians, and then involved in amongst all those are fee simple lands owned by, in some cases, Indians, but in many cases by non-Indians. And so then if you draw this reservation boundary and say, this is the Crow Reservation, the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, you say, it's going to be a sovereign nation. If I'm in the middle of that, I don't have any say in it because I'm not a citizen of the tribe. I'm a citizen of Montana. Montana taxes my land if I have it in the middle of that reservation. That land mosaic, I think, makes the governance structure all the more difficult. I live in a county. It's a sovereign county of sorts, or you live in the sovereign state of Colorado or Montana. But as a citizen of that group, I get to have some say in how decisions get made. If I'm a non-citizen inside a reservation and the tribe has sovereignty, it has a difficult time trying to exercise that because I'm going to resist. And it means that tribes, this is one of the biggest things that tribes lack, I think, in the sovereign context. They don't really have the power to tax. And they can't because, again, this mosaic that's there. Without the power to tax, how do you run a government? You have to depend on grants from the federal government. I was at a conference recently with a bunch of Canadian leaders, and one of them put it so well. He said, we need to get away from funding and start finding revenue. And I think that's the key to getting sovereignty, and one that's we haven't made much progress on.
Can I just add this real quick?
Yeah.
Let's be precise here. It's only property tax that you can't do with trust land. Because tribes have a variety of taxes.
Understood. I didn't make that clear.
Sheldon, do you want to weigh in on this issue of sovereignty?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk about citizenship, and I know that was something so tribes, generally, I'm going to break it down in two general ways, is that tribes define citizenry in two broad ways, and one is blood quantum. It's kind of this antiquated idea that and you'll have a card and it'll say you are one this, or you're 4/4, you're full blood, or you're half, or you're 1/4, and so it's this really antiquated idea that one time we were full. There was a beginning and that person was a full Cheyenne or a full Sioux or whatever tribe that they're from. So this blood quantum. But secondly, there's descendancy. So some tribes, they define their citizenry by descendants. And so that's a big significant part when you talk about tribal sovereignty. Who are you governing? There's actually a quote by Felix Cohen. I want to give you guys this quote because I think it really sets the table for a lot of what's going to be talked about here, but I think it really strikes the imagination of the mind. So I'll give you this quote. It says, and this is back in 1953. It's a pity. Oh, by the way, Felix Cohen is like the godfather of federal Indian law. He worked as a solicitor for the Department of Interior, and he put together the first handbook of federal Indian law. And he wrote it really from a pro-tribal perspective too. So it's used even to this day. I think it might be in the 5th or 6th or 7th edition now. So it's a great book. So it says, it's a pity that so many Americans today think of the Indian as a romantic or a comic figure in American history without contemporary significance. In fact, the Indian plays much the same role in our society that the Jews played in Germany. Like the miner's canary, the Indian marks the shift from fresh air to poison gas in our political atmosphere. And the treatment of Indians, even more than the treatment of the other minorities, reflect the rise and fall in our democratic faith. So beautifully put, and I'll come back around because I think this is relevant to tribal sovereignty, is talking about that idea of the tragedy of the commons. And I think there's some just general things about us living in a tribal community. If this was our tribal community right here, that we probably would be more conscientious of how we treated one another and how we preserved resources for one another. So I think there's some principles in that, that generally that how tribes operate and how we went through 500 years of terror and genocide, and we came out and taught the world about environmentalism and love and humanity. So I think there's some fundamental principles that are just living in a small group kind of flushes out. But I think in America, and this idea of exceptionalism, I like Mark's talking about this ability to hold two competing ideas in your mind, and Felix Cohen talks about the democratic faith in America. And of course, America is named after Amerigo Vespucci. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Thank you. Thank you. And I know there's a Latin influence in the English that we speak today, and I know this, but I think there's some irony in that, is that if we broke America down, ame, rica, the command for him to love, riches, and I think oftentimes in America that we promote that is to put two cows on that pasture. Put 3 actually. It's going to really bring it home for us, and eventually all of us, because of that exceptionalism, will put 5 or 6 or 8 or 9 of our cows on that pasture to get more wealth for ourselves. And so, being able to hold that, and I think inherently tribes, culturally. That idea of loving one another and looking out for the environment is inherently part of our culture.
So it's interesting to me here that when we did our little lightning round and talked about major challenges, nobody talked about education or healthcare or unemployment. Wow. Everybody really, in one way or another, is talking about government, to go back to a theme from our previous panel. Changes that the government can make, the federal courts where tribes are attempting to assert their tribal authority. And it seems to me that, Mark, even in your field, even in archaeology, federal law has been reshaping how we study and talk about Native histories.
Right. Sheldon, that was amazing. Claiming him as my Four Corners brother. We're from adjacent counties, San Juan County, Utah, and Montezuma County, Colorado. So, way to go, bro. Yeah, so I can also tie this back to the previous session, where in the late 1800s, 1880 to 1900, in the same way that animals and we were impacting our natural environment, the people that had settled the West were vacuuming out the archaeological sites. And the artifacts from these sites were ending up in private collections and in the biggest museums back east. That's best illustrated perhaps by a Swedish individual that showed up and moved in with a ranching family in Mancos, Colorado. His name was Gustav Nordenskjöld. And in 1891, he and the Wetherill brothers excavated about 100 archaeological sites on what was Mountain Ute tribal land and what became Mesa Verde National Park. Nordenskjöld, at the end of his year, took all the artifacts to Durango, Colorado, and put them in a crate to ship them back to Europe. And people went nuts, and he was arrested at the Strater Hotel. Has anybody stayed at the Strater Hotel? Beautiful hotel in Durango, Colorado. He sends a telegram to his dad, much trouble, some expense, no danger. There's no law, and they have to let him go. And those artifacts today are in the National Museum of Finland. This leads to the recognition of this destruction leads to a series of these laws. The 1906 Antiquities Act, the 1996 National Historic Preservation Act, the 1970 National Environmental Policy Act, and the 1979 Archaeological Resources Protection Act, all of which address this issue of the protection of archaeological resources, but all from the perspective of Anglos. The preservation, sometimes just for preservation's sake, for the beauty, but the preservation also for what I do, scientific inquiry to understand the human past. None of it addressed native concerns for these resources. Where I live, Utes, Navajos, and Pueblo people interact with these resources on a daily basis. Medicine people use artifacts for medicine ceremonies. Other people use them for other types of ceremonies. The Pueblo people view ancestral Pueblo sites as the footprints of their ancestors, where those sites are not abandoned. They continue to be inhabited by the spirits of their ancestors, and that connection to their ancestors is a vital part of their traditional spiritual life and religions. So, does it ever get addressed legally? Well, it finally sort of does. And I would say the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act has a role. And then the biggest one of all is the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And then another one that not many people realize that I think is also profound is the 1992 amendment to the 1996 National Historic Preservation Act. And this amendment recognized not just archaeological sites, but traditional cultural properties. And a traditional cultural property is a place on the landscape that has been imbued with meaning by native people through their historic use of that landscape. And this is a really hard concept for Anglos to wrap their head around, that it's not about individual sites, it's about the whole landscape. And native people transform this natural landscape into a cultural landscape, where virtually every part of it has a story that's a part of their story. And by recognizing TCPs, it really puts this kind of interaction with the landscape on another scale. So all of those were really important, and those last three finally begin somewhat to provide a native voice into this interaction with archaeological resources.
Yeah, Terry.
Just a quick point to what Marcus said. Through this whole Bears Ears debate, I just several times have written, why are we talking about the United States government managing Bears Ears? Why don't the tribes have sovereignty? We could argue about how big Bears Ears, obviously we do, should be, but why not have the tribes as sovereign nations govern those resources? I see them as theirs, not mine, and I don't see why my government should be that is our federal government, should have a whole lot to do other than to cede those lands lock, stock, and barrel to the tribes and let them manage. But if I could ask a question of Sheldon, he raised a point when I met him here, and I think it was just profound, to me at least. I like to think of the importance of governance structures, and what little I know, I think the old indigenous economies had these governance structures. And then we passed the Indian Reorganization Act in 1935, and we went around to tribes and said, you need a constitution. And we gave them these mock constitutions that sort of start with "we the people." But Sheldon, tell us about constitutions in the context of your tribe.
Yeah, well, thank you. So Northern Cheyenne is a little bit different, and of course here I'm going to talk about my I'm really egocentric here, and I'll be talking about my cultural centric, about my tribe, ethnocentric about my tribe, is that we had a traditional governance long before any United States came along, before we saw any Anglo person. We had a traditional government. Sweet Medicine is the Cheyenne prophet. Sweet Medicine brought us this government. He went to the center of the universe, which is Bear Butte, Montana, Norwus and Cheyenne, and he went inside there, and the Mahian, the holy people, taught him a way of life. And it was the way of life that he brought to the Cheyennes. And with that, there's a ceremonial life. What's unique about Cheyennes, and I'll add this just to kind of give you an idea, is that Cheyennes and a few other tribes could wage all-out war. So when he met with the holy people, they gave him these 4 arrows. And you could really think about the Cheyenne existential anxiety when you think of what these arrows were for. You know, the 2 biggest existential anxieties that Cheyennes probably had is 2 were for hunting, so starvation, and 2 were for war. And so when Cheyennes want to wage all-out war, we point those arrows at our enemy, and every Cheyenne now is going to fight in that war. And so being able to wait, as opposed to just maybe I just don't like Mark and him and I have a dispute, you know. But if we point those arrows, the whole tribe now has a dispute. And so that's one of the significant things about governance. But the point that, and I wrote a paper about it, and don't look it up, but I wrote this paper. It's in the Tribal Law Journal at University of New Mexico. But it talks about our Sundance, the Cheyenne Sundance, and how within that Sundance, you see these constitutional principles. Actually, there's law that happens within a Sundance ceremony. And the Sundance, the essential idea around the Sundance is it's earth renewal. This idea back to environmentalism, you know, is that we're taken from our mother, and we need to give back to our mother. And so this reciprocity that we build with one another and with the earth that we live upon. And so our Constitution and our way of life has been built around that for hundreds of years, you know, thousands of years. It's been built around that idea of reciprocity and sharing. So that's connected to that. But there's work that's been done by the Harvard Indian Country Economic Development. I know I'm messing the name of it up, but Harvard did all this work in Indian country, and what they found, and the closer that you could get, and this is true, like I'm going to say this, and everybody's going to say, of course, the closer you could get to a community's culture, the better the economy is going to be. And I believe it starts with our constitutions. And commercial codes may be the second thing. And so those constitutions are really essential of how we operate as tribes. And if we could get them closer to the proximity of culture, and that even leads to the question, do we even need a constitution? Tribes, do we even need a constitution? And so that question is a legit question too. So,
I think that brings up a good question. We're bouncing around the term tribal sovereignty, but like, what does it really mean, Mark? What's at stake in it? What are the issues that tribal sovereignty would allow a community to solve?
Well,
for
first,
example?
and this goes back to your first question, but when you get back to wherever you're at, Google my name and tribal sovereignty and watch the YouTube video and you'll have some fun with it. I'll just leave it at that. I also have a family history on tribal constitutions. My great uncle was a guy by the name of George P. Levada, and he worked for the Roosevelt administration charged with writing constitutions.
Oh, wow.
And he went around, particularly the Pacific Northwest, and went tribe to tribe and talked to them. One of the factors in that was post-World War II, there was this great pressure to terminate tribes. The United States thought it made this very expensive mistake, and that the idea of tribes in a modern society didn't match. You also had a senator from Utah, Arthur Watkins, who was extremely aggressive, who hated government, hated everything to do with government, and tribes fit into that. And this led to this big movement of termination. So part of the idea of the constitutions was this permanence and being able to come up with something that led to a structure that would survive no matter what happened next. And so it was imperfect, but it made sense in the context of the time. One of the ways we're telling this story that I think is intriguing is so often it becomes a story about the failure of government. And if you look at it over time, it's just the opposite. And you mentioned early on health, and I'll use that as an example. And in fact, I have a current, in the current issue of Daedalus, I know everyone has that on their subscription list. I have a thing about Indian health as a story. And this should be one of the stories that is the greatest success story of the United States in the history of the country. In 1955, by any measure, Indian health was at the very bottom of any statistic you could measure. People died, the average age was in the 40s. Today, we're fighting over disparity in Indian health at about a 4-year gap. That should be a success story, and yet we focus on the gap. One of the first decisions made by the new Indian Health Service when it was created is to invest money in sanitation. And at the time, they said, why are you doing that instead of just hiring more doctors? And they said clean water is essential. What happened was the infant mortality rate dropped to actually in 1956 and 7 and 8 and 9 was lower than the US populations. But it was this strategic decision to invest over the long term. Today, again, because of the way we tell the story about the government, you wouldn't know that 60% of the Indian health system is run by tribes. And tribes have been doing some of the most innovative healthcare in the country. In fact, if you really want to have great healthcare, Alaska Native medical system may be the best in the world. No questions asked. The quality of care, one of the things they did when they first took over the system is they surveyed everybody and said, what do you really want in healthcare? And people said, well, you know, every time we go, we have to wait all day. And so they created these really small units, and you go in now, and there's a sign that says, if you've been here longer than 15 minutes, something's wrong, talk to us. And they designed the system with the patient in mind. The other thing they did, and people around the world are studying this, is they put the patient in charge. And this has become a common theme in medicine now, but this was really innovative when it first started in Alaska. And they work with teams of doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals, but it's the patient deciding what's important, where the resources are going to go, and who's going to follow. So those are kind of the ways we get to these stories of sovereignty, because it comes back to, in Alaska, sovereignty was, we're going to do it our way, and we're going to adapt the system. And a very, very one that continues to be a debate is in Alaska, they just said they had a heck of a time getting dentists to move to rural villages. And so they looked around the world for solutions. And in New Zealand, they found a dental healthcare practice that was mid-level practice. And they said, we're going to do this in Alaska. The Alaska Dental Society, which is the American Dental Association, said, absolutely not. This is practicing dentistry without a license. We will sue you if you do it. They said, no, we're basing this on tribal sovereignty. We're going to do it anyway. The Alaska experiment was so successful that the caries rate, juvenile caries rate, went from the highest to the world to entire generations of kids who are cavity-free. And that happened in one generation. And that's a really practical example of how tribal sovereignty is taking a complex problem and saying, we're going to solve it our own way.
Bravo.
So let me borrow the question that my colleague Steve Aaron asked in the previous round and say, can we talk about places where we can see real successes or real problems, either with the federal government or with tribal governments in terms of addressing some of the key issues in Indian country? Let's have some quick answers and see where we go. Terry.
Well, I love the success stories Mark just told. My favorite success story is the timber management on the Flathead Reservation in Montana by the Salish, Kootenai Confederated Tribes. We did a study that compared the management of tribal forests with nearby national forests, and we've been bashing the federal government, so you'll like this. If you look at how the tribes manage the forests on the Flathead, they have a better age distribution of trees. They have a far better species distribution of trees. They have far better water quality. And since I'm an economist, as I said in the other session, someone who's pretty good with numbers but doesn't have enough personality to be an accountant, the numbers, the economic numbers tell a lot. The nearby national forests almost break even, dollar spent for dollar taken in. The Flathead takes in $2 for every dollar they spend, and they reinvest that into education, into healthcare, into water supplies. And so it's just a wonderful case. It happens because the tribe has taken over management of its forests through a contractual process with the Department of Interior, BIA. So, you know, I think those stories need to be told, retold, and then replicated.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one would be, I think, we're so good at telling the narrative of despair that we forget to tell the narrative of excellence. And Indian country has so many great stories of excellence. You think of the 19th century, and I bet everyone in this room could name great chiefs and what they did to change the country in really remarkable ways, whether Chief Joseph or you could go down the list. The 20th century was like that too. And in fact, I think the greatest leader of the 20th century was a woman by the name of Lucy Covington. And Lucy Covington in Washington State almost single-handedly stopped termination. And she did it in a way of building. In fact, you think of folks like Vine Deloria, very big names. She called them up and said, I want you to come to Colville and work with me for free. You have to pay all your own expenses, but this is important. And he picked up and did just that. And a whole bunch of people, not just Vine, but that was the stature of Lucy Covington. The great thing is she did it all. Whenever she wanted to lobby in Washington, she'd sell a cow. And she'd sell a cow and go to D.C. and Washington lobby. So I think the narrative of excellence is one of the things most important.
I was going to share one that I was actually a part of. I was fortunate enough to work for the Ute Indian tribe in Utah. I talked to you a little bit about work in foster care and children that are in abuse and neglected situations. Utah and the Ute tribe, they've had a conflicted relationship from the very beginning that Utah was established as a state, or since Mormons moved to Utah in 1847. I said Mormons, actually, so somebody was telling me that I need to say Mormons as a historical marker. But we took over the Ute Indian tribe, the Nooch. They took over child welfare services, so the state managed it, case managed it. And at the height, there was 200 children in foster care from the Ute Indian tribe. But when we took it over, had the cultural values. Cultural sovereignty is also, and I like that Mark talked about Alaska and how they took over. So running the program, how it fits to you culturally, and of course, that's intuitive, right? As you get more proximate to culture, the better success you're going to have. We reduced the amount of kids in foster care by more than half, and instead of having kids placed in stranger foster care, 80% of kids are placed with kin. And so that was a great success that I was able to be a part of. I'll remember that the rest of my life. Actually, it's one of the greatest professional successes that I'm sure I'll have for the rest of my life, at being a part of that big movement that happened within that community and giving youth a voice. And so that was my experience.
Thank you, Mark.
Prior to 1990 and the passage of NAGPRA, there was not a single, prior to the passage of NAGPRA, the archaeological resources on tribal lands were managed by outsiders. Today, I work with the 21 Pueblo nations, the Apache Nation, the Navajo Nation, and the Ute Nations. Every one of those now has either a cultural preservation office or what's called a tribal historic preservation officer who manage the archaeological resources on their lands in a way that's consistent with native values.
Great. These are all fantastic.
Can I give the biggest failure, in my opinion?
Yeah, briefly.
Eloise Cabell filed suit against the federal government in the 90s, I believe, maybe even the 80s, because the federal government couldn't account for the trust funds that the funds that they collected from lands owned by Indians. The payments go to Washington, and then Washington sends them back. The federal government could not account for the funds. Ultimately, she was joined in a class action suit, and I think it was $275 billion the federal government could not account for in the Indian trust funds. The suit went on and on, was finally settled under the Obama administration, and people celebrated the fact that the tribes got back $2.3 billion. I heard that, and I was like, what's to celebrate here? You send money to the abysmal, the big pit in Washington, and they can't account for it, and then they find $2.3 billion and hand it back. The management of trust funds for the money that belongs to Indians held in trust by the government is just appalling.
So we have time for one lightning round question here before we go to questions from the audience. Indian gaming. Is it the panacea that people anticipated when it began to become a more widespread phenomenon, about 15 years ago? Start at that end and come this way.
Me? I don't know.
Okay. You're an archaeologist. You'll be excavating these sites.
So the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was passed in I want to say 1988. And we had, I don't know, the 90s, there was a lot of gaming, but I think there's a mythology that's kind of attached to gaming. Not all tribes are rich off Indian gaming. So of course, being close to an economic center would really help you out. And so I know there's some tribes that are really doing really well, actually. And so not all tribes are actually living in poverty and squalor. There's the naming rights of the 2 professional stadiums in Phoenix actually are named, our tribes actually have the naming rights to the Phoenix Suns where they play and where the hockey team plays down in Phoenix. So a lot of tribes are doing really well. But I think what gaming did, as well as I think there's been a couple of other tools that tribes have used to expand economic flow. Southern Ute, actually, the tribe here in this state, they have a AAA credit rating, better than the United States, I believe, right? And so they've diversified so well. They do have a great casino. If you go down there, they have a great casino, but they've diversified so well that if you live in Denver, you might be living in a Southern Ute community, actually, and you wouldn't even know it. So they've done some really amazing things as far as economic tools. And so that's part of the story, but only a few tribes have really benefited for economic gaming. You come up to Northern Cheyenne, we have the Charging Horse Casino, but it doesn't really make too much money because we're off the thoroughfare. But if you do go up there, throw some coins in.
Let me answer that in a very different way. One thing I think is important to note about Indian gaming is that there's a 10,000-year history.
Right.
This is not something that cropped up because of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act or the Western world's view of gambling as a sin. Tribal communities have thought it's part of our stories. Where I'm from, Shoshone-Bannock, they have found artifacts from 11,000 years ago that are gambling instruments. It's part of our culture. And the idea of that being just another technological form, I think it's just something that's always been part of our culture.
Why didn't I think of that?
Yeah.
I knew that.
That's for you next time you get invited back, Mark. You can steal it. I will end with our economist here.
Yeah, well, it's not a panacea for the reason Sheldon suggested for tribes that are isolated in places like Montana. It's not a panacea because the successful ones are finding that the states are starting to say, oh, that's a goose that lays golden eggs. Maybe we should have some of those eggs. And they either try to find ways to make the tribes cough up some of the revenue, or they open state casinos to compete with them. And so it's not a long-run solution. The best thing, and it kind of picks up on the themes of what Sheldon was saying, I think the best thing to come out of it is tribes have begun to learn we can get the business acumen, we can develop it, and once we develop the business acumen, we can do business. And the revenues from gaming help to do that. But tribes have really learned how to contract with outsiders and enter into contracts that are very successful for long-term revenue generation. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest things to come out of gaming is the lessons of business acumen.
And to build on that, Thomas Jefferson said, gambling taxes are the only ones people willingly pay.
Great. Let's go to questions from the audience. This gentleman in the white shirt, David.
What about Indian water rights?
Well, under the Winters Doctrine, a doctrine that came in 1910, I believe, the federal courts ruled that surely we didn't mean to set up reservations without giving them water rights. The water rights that they have in the prior appropriation context are to be dated at the time the reservation was created, and that left open a big question of, well, how much water? And that's been the gnarly question. The tribes that have been really successful have negotiated settlements of how much water they get, have negotiated into those settlements the ability to trade the water, and they have also negotiated into those settlements revenues either from federal sources or state sources to help them develop the water that they do have. And so I think Indian water rights are a case where Indians really will get the control they should have over their resources and be able to use them. Quick story, I got a call from, I've forgotten which of the Utah tribes was settling, maybe it was, at any rate, I thought I was going to get a consulting job because they said, you know, we just settled our water claims and we're thinking about marketing some of it, and we wonder what you think. Los Angeles, or Salt Lake wants to enter into a contract to buy some of our water. We might want to hire you. And I said, well, you know, before I'd sign that contract, I'd recognize that water flows downhill, and at the bottom of the hill is Los Angeles. They might pay more. And they said, that's what we thought too. I didn't get the job. But they had it figured out, and that's the beauty of settling those water right disputes.
Yeah.
Quick question.
Wait, hold on. Wait for a mic just a moment.
You mentioned cavity-free fluoridation.
No, most of the villages don't have fluoridation. It's just, I mean, one of the things the mid-level practitioners do is workshops and hygiene and talk about things. Some of it's diet. I mean, one of the unfortunate aspects of the Western infiltration of culture is soda pop, and getting people off of soda pop and to have a glass of water on occasion, things like that.
And the blue, yeah.
What one or two or more things would you recommend that Anglos, those of us who are learning about these things, can do in an effort to help support better Native American rights?
Mark and Sheldon.
I have a good one for that. One of the most successful programs, I think, in the country, again, came out of Native Americans getting elected to the legislature in Montana, is a thing called Indian Education for All. And you cannot graduate from high school in Montana now without having a basic understanding of Indian education. And I think throughout the West, that ought to be part of the deal.
Sheldon?
I agree with what Mark says. I think educating yourself, I think that's a significant thing. But if you're looking to donate to organizations, there's a lot of organizations out there that you could donate to. The Native American Rights Fund, based out of Boulder. There's another one, actually, if your stick is sovereignty. I think sovereignty, having the courts, tribal courts. I mentioned this to other people earlier, the National American Indian Court and Judges Association. And so some of these organizations that you could really support. I'll share this really quick. And as my family, so my family, we're direct descendants of the Sand Creek Massacre, actually. And I think there's some learning that's happened in our school. So every year, my kids are, I tell the teacher, I just barely actually put my kids into school. They had their first day. And I tell the teacher every year, if you need help around Thanksgiving to not do anything racist, I'm happy to come in. I'm happy to come in. And lately, I've been doing things around Sand Creek Massacre, and it's amazing what kids are. I have a 6th grader and I have a 4th grader, and it's amazing what kids, where they're at with all this, and they're way ahead of us, actually. And so being a direct descendant, actually, and we know this in our oral history. These are the stories that I was told as a child, and you think about this historical trauma that I know the details of this, is that when Sand Creek happened, maybe like you guys, when you had children or your grandchildren, I imagine this, is that my great-grandfather, Charles Spotted Elk, Hoish was his Indian name, Cheyenne name. He slept in between his parents on that cold November morning. And the cavalry, the Colorado Volunteers militias, they came in, they slaughtered over 150 Cheyennes, sleeping Cheyennes on that cold morning in November. A girl saved, what we know is maybe a cousin or older sister saved my great-grandfather, took him to all the survivors, they dug into the creek bed, into the side of the creek bed, actually, and they survived. But we know that they took this little baby, I know this story, they took this little baby back to get sucked from his dead mother before they did that 20-mile walk. We know this in our oral history. We have these powerful stories that's part of it. But outside of this, I'll say this is a Cheyenne proverb. I'll give you this, some hope. I like when people talk about hope. And I was raised with that hope. I wouldn't be here before you if I wasn't raised with that hope. Is the Cheyenne proverb. I'll say it in Cheyenne first, and I'll bring it back and to hopefully answer the question. In Cheyenne, it goes, Hoe e he hotomona. Avisio wustanisto. Hotomistum evis huaef wustanis. And what that means in Cheyenne is that we all go through struggles, all of us. We're all going to go through struggles, some big, some small, and that's not what's going to define us. Actually, overcoming those are what define us. I'm paraphrasing on that for you. And so how we confront these challenges, how we deal with our history, how we deal with the marginalized of our society, that's going to ultimately define our humanity. I believe that. So I believe education. Thank you.
And I'd add that I think Mark is being too modest here, because if you want to really know what's happening in Indian country today, you should read and subscribe to Indian Country Today, which he edits, which is a really smart journal that covers political, environmental, educational affairs.
Thank you.
And keeps you on your toes.
And you don't have to subscribe, but we do take memberships.
Okay. Do we have time for one question? Right here.
So there was the controversy a couple of years ago about oil pipelines coming down from Canada through Indian territory. And I think in the Obama administration, they prohibited, and then the administration's changed. And what's the current status of all that, and why did it change? And who stood up for Indian rights? And wasn't that through, they were very concerned about the water quality if there was a leakage problem or whatever.
Right. And it's an ongoing dispute. Just last week, a federal court said that the surprise, Trump administration didn't follow the process involved. And they were reviewing that, and so we'll see where that goes. One of the most significant things from Standing Rock, and not many people know this because it's still ongoing, is a group of working with Standing Rock Tribe and New York investors said, we're going to talk to companies about how they invest in these projects and what is required to have tribal consent in a way that is meaningful. And a lot of the attention goes on to banks and the de-investment of the banks, but that's kind of on the margins. The real thing that's happening is folks getting investors to say to companies, if you're going to go in there, what are the opportunity costs? What's it going to cost if there's a major protest involved? How much money are we going to lose because of that? Is there a better way to do it? And very much under the radar, a lot of companies are engaged with tribes now on that very discussion and coming up with alternative strategies.
Great.
I think to some of the points Mark made earlier about the archaeological sites, clarifying the jurisdiction that exists within and between tribes and other governmental entities is a key to not having it be what it was in Standing Rock, I think. Canada's farther ahead in this regard. There's a pipeline that's being built through British Columbia, and at this meeting I mentioned earlier with some of the Canadian tribal leaders, band leaders, several of the leaders involved in that said, we're not having any trouble because we're at the negotiating table. We have some jurisdiction here, and once that's clear, then they can negotiate. They can do what Mark's talking about, sit at the table and say, hey, we'll let you do it, but you have to do it our way.
Great. Well, on a note of hope, please join me in thanking our panelists.